Welcome, everybody. I know we've had a little bit of a break, but I'm so glad to be back with our regular series called Let's Talk About Race. I'm the Executive Director of NICU Parent Network, Keira Sorrells, and I'm joined, of course, by my colleague and dear friend, Gigi Khonyongwa-Fernandez, who is our board president. This
Hello,
series,
everyone.
hello. It's so good to be back. We've had
It is.
a very busy fall, so we're glad to be able to get back together and have these discussions. You know, this series we've been doing it for about a year and a half now already.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Has it been that
I
long?
know it has,
Wow.
yes,
Yeah.
and I just love it. And the feedback that we get is that we really are doing what we said. What we set out to do was to have lively, frank, honest and blame-free discussions about race and racial inequality in the US and those subtle and blatant manifestations in the health disparities and inequities that are experienced in the NICU by people of color. And one of my favorite things that you say, Gigi, is talk without action is just noise. So we want to make
Yeah.
sure that we aren't just talking, right? But that we're also
Yes.
providing some takeaways for you, our listeners, and the leaders in this community. So it's so
Mhm.
good to be back. Um,
Yeah. And I'm on a buzz. So if I sound a little bit like more often I normally am, it's because I've had the opportunity to be at the summit with you and all the other amazing Nikki parent leaders last month now. So
yes.
that was so incredible, and it kind of helped well, it's great to be together, but then also, just talking about these kind of issues, it just highlighted even more why it's important for us to continue to have these conversations.
Yes, absolutely. It is, it is kind of like being on a bit of a high after being
Yeah,
with so many, just committed and passionate and
yeah,
it's so great to be together and to spend time face to face. I mean, I love that we can connect over virtual means and
yeah.
Zoom and stuff like this, but there really is just something so special about being in person. And, I feel like with our members, we see a lot of what they do online. We see their social media stories. But when you actually get to sit down and talk to somebody and really, have that deeper personal connection and
Yeah.
you learn their story and what brought them to this space and what keeps them going,
Hmm.
it really, I love what we're going to be talking about today. It just kind of feels so perfect to be talking about
Yeah.
storytelling, right? Um,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
in preparation for this, I did just a little bit of searching, and I found this great article from the Harvard Business Review,
Mm,
just talking about how leaders can influence, teach, and inspire. And one of
hmm.
the things that it says about storytelling, it activates different parts of your brain, right? Than just
Mm,
listening to
mm.
a lecture that's just
Yeah.
like fact after fact after fact, right? But with
Hmm.
storytelling, you have connection, you have engagement, you're going to
Yeah.
appeal to different sorts of learners. You're conveying learning that sticks because a story sticks much
Yeah.
more than, facts and figures and statistics, right?
Exactly.
Um, so
Exactly.
I would, with that, let's just jump right in. So talk
Yeah.
to me. Let's talk about
And I love,
this.
yeah, and I love what you said. I think so yeah, today we're going to be talking about storytelling and how you can use storytelling as a tool to begin to address and combat racism within your team and within your communities, within your whatever space that you're in. Um, and I kind of feel like when we were talking, I was kind of thinking when you were sharing initially here, I was thinking, wow, this is almost like we could I was thinking about if we were in person, but even virtually, we can do it like a almost like a 2 or 3 point series because
Mhm.
it's it's a very simple concept, but a very complex and powerful concept because
Yeah.
we all are we all have stories, we all are stories. And so what I was
Mhm.
thinking, like, understanding what storytelling is, the impact of it, but also the intersectionality of stories, and then also the commonality of stories. And
Mm-hmm.
so they're all and how all of those can lead to some tangible and sustainable and meaningful actions and change within your space. So
Right.
I'll see how that comes out in my head, because things is kind of he's kind of boil over and don't know how it's going to come out.
Yep.
But yeah, so there was an author named Julius Lester. He was like an author and civil rights activist, and he wrote a lot of children's books and also just books for adults, and he wrote a lot around storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, one of his books is called "Let's Talk About Race."
Oh,
Actually,
really?
yes,
Oh, did we steal that?
yeah.
We might need to
I
change our
didn't even
title then.
steal it. Yeah, I didn't. I think I learned about him later after we've already coined it, although he had coined it before. Um, but
Yeah.
um, but in that particular book, he talks about he kind of starts off, it's a children's book, but it's around, saying, starting off conversations of I'm a story and so are you, and so is everyone, and how do our lives connect, and talks about that in many ways our lives are the same story, but there are differences in the details.
Mm,
So that goes
yeah.
back to the commonality bit about, what are the things that we all want? What are all
Mm-hmm.
things that we all aspire to? What are all things that we need?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was quite interesting. So his
Yeah.
perspective. Um,
I
and I
love
think,
that we all are stories. I just love that,
yes,
thinking about that. And it makes me think too about, how often is a NICU parent or a bereaved parent or a leader
mm-hmm,
asked to come and share their story at a
yep,
conference, right? And why is that?
yeah,
They have all kinds of researchers and physicians and nurses and therapists that are sharing their research, but they they
yes,
recognize the importance of humanizing all of those statistics, right?
yes, because without, you're right, because like you said earlier, I mean, without that, it is just noise and it's just facts,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no sort of meaning behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
although none of us wanted to be in this space, none of us chose to say we're going to be in the NICU space, we're going to be in the bereaved space, we didn't
Mm-hmm.
choose that. Because that did occur, there is something about, you talk all the time, Keira, about lived experience and
Mm-hmm.
how important that is, and to always have that laser focus
Right.
um when you're talking about how you do your healthcare, when you're talking
Right.
about policy, when you're talking about research, you cannot, because otherwise it's empty.
Right.
It's just
Yeah.
numbers and whatever, but it has nothing to
Mm-hmm.
do with, so it is about the humanizing of it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
there was another kind of I think she was like an economist, and
Mm-hmm.
her name was Ida Bird. I think it's Ida Bird, Byrd. And
Mm-hmm.
she talked about this idea that, well, not idea, but it's because of what you were saying, is that we're all a kind of a sum of our story. So you as a person,
Mm.
you as a leader, you
Some of
as
those.
your community, our society, that we are a sum of our stories. And in understanding that, it helps us to begin to explain kind of behaviors and actions.
Mm-hmm.
And then she talks about how once all those stories kind of get embedded into a culture, then they become like the master narratives, like the blueprints for how people follow. And if you think
Mm.
about racism, particularly within the US, and I wanted to make sure that when we're talking about racism, I know we've said it before, but it's good to kind of reiterate it. We're not just talking about black and white.
Right.
We're talking about race. Race is, in some ways, some people say it's a social construct, but race, all the different racial groups that
Mm-hmm.
exist within the
Yeah.
US and sort of
Yeah.
globally. So when you're thinking about that, and how those narratives help to explain. So in the US, it's predominantly black and white because of the history. So when you're looking at
Mm-hmm.
healthcare within the US, and you see sort of black and white, you see Hispanic, you see Asian, you see all of that. And you you have to understand how those stories get embedded into the culture. So how our
Right.
Western healthcare system has been created, it's been created from one narrative only.
Mm.
And
Talk about that.
so
Can you talk about
talk
that?
about that.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
What is that
Yeah.
one narrative?
So the narrative is the white male's narrative.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's been the narrative. So and a lot of females, Native Americans, Black people were used as objects,
Mm-hmm.
to learn about the human body.
Mm-hmm.
Women were not considered, they were definitely not equal as well. So you kind of wonder why does women's health, for example, is always kind of lagged behind,
Right.
because you don't really have that narrative, you don't have that perspective, of from the people who are making the decisions, who are making the
Right.
inventions. Or
Mm-hmm.
if you do have those people that are, of that underrepresented group doing these various things, their narratives have been silent.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't hear about women physicians, or, for example, Charles Drew, who was a Black man who invented blood transfusion, the
Mm-hmm.
process of blood transfusion, for example. And
Mm.
so what Ida Bird talks about is understanding what the master narratives are, or
Mm.
the predominant narratives are that are within your community. So
Mm-hmm.
when you're as leaders, when you are looking at the people that you serve, um, it's about stepping back and saying, well, what is that what is that story that
Right.
continuously comes through, and is it actually the true story,
Mm.
or is it just only one aspect of it? So if
Mm-hmm.
we're saying that, um, your Hispanic population, or Asian population, or the Black population, there are gaps. Okay, so
Right.
there's definitely truth to that,
Mm-hmm.
but we have to go further and say, well, what else is there?
Yeah.
And that's when you begin, as leaders, you begin to start changing the narrative. When you start changing the narrative
Mm.
of that
Mm-hmm.
story, you start changing the behavior. When you start changing the behavior,
Mm.
you start changing the institution and society, and on and on and on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when you think about, yeah, so most of when you think about the US healthcare system, who do you see as being the well-renowned physicians,
Mm-hmm.
um, the inventors, the schools? Who are at the heads of those, of that narrative?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see Black people? Do you see Hispanic people? Do you see Native American people? Do you see Asian people being at the helm?
Mm-hmm. Not
Most of us want,
predominantly.
not predominantly, and that goes back to that
Mm-hmm.
master narrative. So it's not saying that they're
Mm-hmm.
not there.
Right.
And that's the thing. Like, you think when you were talking earlier, just a second ago, about NICU parents, and about how you've been asked to tell
Mm-hmm.
your story. Doesn't you've always been there.
Mm-hmm.
You've
Right.
always, your story's always existed.
Yeah.
Um, it's just that no one's ever asked you, until recently, to kind of say it, to share it.
Right.
But it
Yeah.
doesn't minimize the fact that you have lived your experience.
Right. Right.
You know what I mean?
I think
So,
that it speaks to one of the things that actually our keynote speaker,
mm,
Ruchika Tulshian, talked about at the
mm,
summit. We were talking about develop inclusion on purpose, and we talked about
yes,
the importance of amplifying the voices of others. And she told this
yeah.
wonderful story that's in her book about how Marilyn Monroe elevated Ella
Oh, yes, I
Fitzgerald,
love that.
because Ella Fitzgerald wasn't able to book the big important club, but Marilyn Monroe could. And so what Marilyn Monroe did was she said, "Hey, you book Ella Fitzgerald, and I will be in the front row every single night," because the club knew that that would bring people, and Marilyn knew that Ella needed to have the spotlight shined on her. And I think when you're talking about who do we see, when we look at a lot of the conferences and a lot of the parents who are being asked, primarily they are, white females. And so it really is important that if we have a speaking opportunity, that we pass the mic, as Ruchika says, and make sure that all
Yeah.
stories are being represented um, at these conferences, in these opportunities.
Ye-
I get like when you're starting out and you get a speaking opportunity and you want it so bad, you know, but at the same time, have you already had an opportunity like that? Just because you pass one to somebody else doesn't mean you're not going to get asked again. It doesn't make your story irrelevant. I just like to think of it as, let's broaden the scope of those stories.
Exactly. And that I think that's a very important point, is to make sure that when we're saying this, we're not saying, and Erica Gore talks about this, it's
Hmm.
part of our of NPN.
Yeah.
It's not about counseling out, it's about adding to.
Right.
And so the difference is in the detail. So we all may
Hmm.
have this a very similar story of a NICU experience, but when you're from underrepresented, from a racial perspective, there's so many other subtle,
Right.
nuance, and also blatant details
Hmm.
that add to that story. And
Right.
so you're right, like I said, you may pass it on this time, but then um at some point you would tell your other story. And then
Hmm.
as a team, remembering that the strength of your team and the strength of the impact you make in your community and
Hmm.
in your hospital and in your, whatever space that you're in, is the culmination or totality of all your stories.
Yes. Yes. I love that.
And so, yeah, and it does. So it goes back to when you're saying, you know, Marilyn Monroe. I love that story, and I'm glad you
Hmm.
brought that up. Didn't think that I'm going to be less of Marilyn Monroe
Right. Right.
if I said, you know,
Exactly.
but she understood that, in order for Ella to be elevated, she had to
Hmm.
be there. I had to
Right.
be. So it's almost like people always say, like, you're standing on shoulders of giants. We are continually standing on one another's shoulders.
Hmm.
Um, and that's that continual kind of accumulation of stories.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, and there are many ways
Right.
that you can do this I mean, I don't know if that answer, first of all, because I tend to speak, I have 1,000 things in my head but all at once. But did that answer your query when you said, tell me more
Yeah. About that
about the
master
narrative,
narrative.
master
Yeah.
narrative?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
did. Absolutely.
And that could be a query that you ask as leaders, is like, when you're even, um rattling off facts or something about your particular
Hmm.
community, ask yourself, is that the master narrative? Or are there other narratives out there
Hmm.
that
Right.
I need to be mindful of and be aware
Yeah.
of?
Yeah.
Because remembering, are you adding to that narrative or are you changing it?
Mm-hmm.
And what you're wanting to do is change it, and change it for the better,
Hmm.
for all the people that you serve. So there's several, strategies and tools and templates that we can use. But one of the things that I was sharing with Keira about is
Yeah.
something called the storytelling project model. And I'm
Hmm.
not sure if
Yeah. Let me just
if
bring
we
that up real
yeah
quick.
if okay, if any of you, so while you bring it up, I'll just kind of tell you about it. It was actually developed by a team of people, but it was led by excuse me, a professor of education at Barnard College named Leanne Bell. And really, what she and her team wanted to do was kind of create a framework that communities and leaders and organizations and groups can use to begin to start kind of having that dialogue, having that storytelling dialogue, and looking at what your individual stories are, um, and how they can kind of connect. Particularly, their focus was how, using it to better understand racism, and how
Mm-hmm.
racism kind of operates within organizations, operates within societies, how it impacts communities and our kind of, our society as a whole. So they were
Hmm.
looking primarily, they created it primarily to look at racism.
Okay.
So do you have it up?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so I thought it'd be a good thing. Again, we always talk about putting things in your toolbox. It's a
Hmm.
good thing, good way for us as leaders to start, um, one way of tackling racism, and how do we make change. I love One of the things I loved about this particular model is the part about the action change at the top right hand corner. So
Hmm.
the storytelling does not stand alone. The storytelling should all point to a tangible action, a tangible
Yes.
change.
Yes, if that's one piece of advice I could give to anybody who is new to sharing their story,
Mm,
it means nothing just to share your story, right?
mm,
I mean, that, yes, that will make people tear up. It will make people feel, maybe enraged for a moment. But if all you do is share your story and you don't give them an action at the end or a takeaway at the end, it's not going to last. They're going to go about their day. They're going to go about their practice. They're not going to be changed. They're not going to have a way of, changing their practice, improving their practice.
yes, yes. And so like when you that's a very good point, I think. And when you are going and being asked to tell your story, one thing to always lead with is the CTA. So call to action. What is my call to action for this audience?
Mm-hmm.
What do I want them to do differently than what they're doing now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's very, very important. Because that's what you're all about as leaders, is impacting change.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, and we can talk more about this, but I just wanted to share this with everyone today.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about sort of your stories having four key areas, and that there are kind of four
Mm-hmm.
types of stories.
Mm-hmm.
Talks about the stock stories, concealed stories, resistance stories, and emerging stories. And so, and how these story types are kind of continually, how they're connected and how they're continually reinforcing the
Mm-hmm.
narratives that we're beginning to that we're saying. And again, going back to that master narrative, when we're talking about this, how do we use each one of these stories to begin to change those narratives? And this
Mm-hmm.
is something I would actually recommend you as leaders do within your own team.
Mm-hmm.
And just see how that feels. Do it a few times, because your
Yeah.
stories, and what's coming out for yourselves, and then
Mm-hmm.
looking at how we then expand it further out, to your
Mm-hmm.
communities and organizations, etc.
Yeah.
Um, but it's not me at any time. But I just want to kind of go through how they define each one of these
Yeah.
areas.
Perfect. That's what I was
So
going to ask you to do.
yeah. So this starts off with the stock stories. So the stock stories. I don't have a, well, you can see it. I don't have, like, I feel like I need to have a little laser
A
light
little
to be able to
pointer.
see what it is.
Let's see if I can
Yeah, pointer.
I can do a little circle.
So okay. So the stock stories are the stories or tales that are told by the dominant group. And these are the stories that are passed on historically and through all the documents, and it's kind of celebrated in some ways. It's what we hear on the media, it's what we hear. So it's those are the things that are kind of explaining the racial dynamics that support that group. So and in some ways, what this particular group was saying, it legitimizes the dominant group. So in
Mm,
this case, we're talking about race, so it's legitimizing a dominant white racial group. One, so when you think about what is the narrative, when you think about the Black community, the Hispanic community, the Asian community, what is that the dominant narrative that you hear?
mhm.
Maybe they have less than, they're not as educated, they don't have as much access, and
Mhm.
some of those things, factual things, can be true, but because again, that narrative has heavily influenced the US system. It's influenced our
Sure.
healthcare system, our school system, our housing
Mhm.
system, our
Yep.
infrastructure. So that
Yep.
narrative of non-whites being less than has permeated every kind of facet of our being.
Mhm. Yep.
Um, but that is a stock story. So that is almost kind of like we talked about earlier, the master narrative.
Mm.
Um, it stopped me at any time, Keira,
Yep.
for all of
Yep.
these.
You're good.
And then go and then she talks about the concealed stories. So the concealed stories are the stories that are kind of just beneath the surface. Those ones that are not known so much, and they're
Mhm.
constantly kind of pushed in the back,
Mhm.
going to your when you were talking about the Marilyn Monroe and Ella Fitzgerald.
Mhm.
Everyone knew Ella Fitzgerald was like an
Right.
amazing singer, you know,
Right.
but
Right.
you didn't really want to showcase that, you
Mhm.
know, in the stock space. You want to keep
Mhm.
them separate. And
Mhm.
remembering what they're saying is all these stories are connected. So we got to make sure
Mhm.
that they are all connected. So the concealed stories are those ones that we kind of push back, that we kind of repress and conveniently forget. And I hear it now, people will say racism doesn't exist. It's not as bad as it was. I've heard people say, it's just you're bringing things up in the past, so why can't you live in the future? And that helps, again, the stock stories, because
Sure.
it prevents you from looking at the reality.
Right.
So these are the stories that, like, things are bubbling under, those kind of details that, when you are of Asian descent and you're coming in into a hospital, and they're expecting you to be subservient. They're expecting you to not question. They're expecting you to not advocate, because
Right.
the stock story has already dominated that this person, they're expecting you to be, you know, um, to be Harvard educated.
Right.
They're expecting.
Right.
So all these, even these kind
Yeah.
of reverse discriminatory, we think of positive stereotypes,
Right.
all of these things come into those. And so when you come in a different space, so it's important for you as leaders to make sure those concealed stories are shared.
Yeah. Yep.
And they talk about, sometimes the concealed stories are kind of like the unwelcome company. We don't want to really talk about that.
Right. Yeah.
Don't talk about that.
Okay.
So
So
and
what
then
about resistance stories?
resistance. Yeah. So the resistance stories are, I kind of think these are kind of this is one of the most powerful, well, I won't say most powerful, but it's a very interesting one. Because these talk about the stories that show or kind of narrate the persistent and innovative and creative ways that people of marginalized groups resist. And they
Okay.
resist racism, and they resist and challenge the stock stories. And they do it in a way that they are, to promote equality. And I think about, I don't know if it was Rashika or somebody you talked about. I think it was during, you had a speaker on, and you was talking about activists. Like we don't even sometimes don't even realize that we're activists, but as leaders,
Yep.
you are activists. You
Right.
are
Absolutely.
changing. Yeah, you're
Yep.
changing. You are kind of creating these resistance stories,
Yeah.
because you're
Yep.
saying that, as a NICU parent, no, I will be in that space. I will
Right.
be a part of the discussion. I will be. And this is why I'm a part of this discussion, because I have done X, I've experienced X, Y, and Z.
Right. Yep.
And so,
Absolutely.
yeah. So I love that. That's the thing, and a lot of times when you used to see the word resistance, people think, oh, they bristle and say it's kind of negative, but it's quite empowering, because you're basically saying
Sure.
that yes, you're allowing that the person has experienced that to begin to change that narrative and to show ways
Yep.
they've done it, be the
Yep.
creative ways they've done it. And then the last one is the transforming stories, and these are the part of the action, the new stories that we are going to construct as a team to challenge those stock stories, to build on, to kind of amplify those concealed and resistive stories. So in the sort of racial aspect, they look at the transforming stories as like that anti-racism and kind of social justice aspect of it. But it is about you as a team. What are you going to be doing? So the emerging, and you see the arrow go straight to action. So what collectively, so now that we've gone through all of those, and this is a process and not something you can do in 2 hours,
Right.
what have you, what, once you get to the emerging part, it's about you collectively saying, well, what are the narratives? And it may be just one new narrative.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're not talking about building Rome in a day. It's
Right.
but what is that one new narrative that's going to impact or cause a significant change or action in my space? And your team, your community, you individual. I mean, once you've gone through this, you probably know each other even more, but more kind of what that one action would look like.
Yeah. Yep.
Make,
One of
and
the
so in
things
the
that this,
middle,
oh,
oh,
sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, you go
No, I was
ahead.
just going to say, and then and because when you're doing that, you see in the middle where it says creating counter storytelling. It's just saying that it's as you're going through that process of stock, conceal, resistance emerging, you are consistently counteracting what the kind of master narrative is. And so that's kind of almost, it's like a rectangle, but it should be a circle of, I think, a
Yeah.
circle of motion.
Yeah.
It leads to action. Yeah, it leads to action.
Yeah. One of the things that I was just thinking about, in terms of the concealed stories and the resistance stories, and is, is making sure that when you're on a team, and maybe it's not you telling your story anymore, but making sure that you're not always going to the same two or three people as well, that you're
Yeah.
giving opportunities to others, because I see that a lot in, like, oh, we need somebody for, for this committee, or we need oh, well, this person, they rattle off someone that they, have worked with in the past. But that person has had a lot of face time or, airtime in the past. And so, that's actually one of the practices that NPN employed with our Speakers Bureau was, yes, someone can come in to our Speakers Bureau and request a specific speaker, but what we prefer to do is have the conference planners fill out what their objectives are. Is there a certain issue that they're wanting to be presented at this conference, a certain experience, and then we share that with all of our speakers. And then whoever has the time and has that alignment can then offer, their speaking opportunity up. And because it's important, again, that we're creating that space for others to come forward as well, that it's not just the same people over and over and over, because that's where you end up with the stock stories, right? If it's the same story over and over and over.
Yes.
You've got to create that
and when
space.
you're talking about
Pass the mic, like
exactly,
Ruchika says.
exactly, pass the mic. That's the key thing. If you don't take anything else from the day, pass the mic. That is what you need to do. And I think that's very, very important, because when you're dealing with this, when you're talking about trying to change and make an action, you don't necessarily want to go to the same, well, first, people who you don't want to go to the same person, because they're tired as well. They're tired of something like, why am I the token Hispanic or token Black, that's gotta do, and that's the or the token NICU parent, or the token woman that's going. No one wants to be in that space, but also no one person, even within underrepresented groups, can speak for everyone.
Right. Absolutely.
We have so many. Yeah, we're so different. There's so many sort of details within each of our stories, even as NICU parents and NICU leaders. There's so much diversity and beauty within the differences. And so I think it's very important, like you said, like not to just kind of even when you try to change the narrative, not go to the same person to change the narrative. And you begin to kind of say who else. That's where that kind of concealed, like who else is out there, maybe who never said anything before,
right? And I know as a leader that can make you nervous, if you don't know if this, how this person is going to do. So I am going to plug one thing. And that is an organization that we're a part of, a coalition we're a part of, called Mama's Voices. So it's created by the Preeclampsia Foundation and Shades of Blue, which does advocate and for women and mothers of color. And they've created a storytelling training that actually, if you are a member of NPN, then you can access that training at no cost. But it does help, it's great because it really teaches emerging leaders and emerging advocates how to make sure that the storytelling is effective. Because we all know there are good storytellers and there are not so good storytellers. And we want to make sure that our advocates, activists, leaders are effective. So again, I've been in that space where it's like, okay, they don't need to hear from me again. I think this person will be good, but I don't know that I've actually heard them speak before. And that can be, I understand as a leader, it's much easier to go with what you know. But if you can provide that kind of training for people in your community, then that's just going to open up those circles of opportunity to get rid of those stock stories.
Yeah. Oh, I love that, because it's kind of like what I'm hearing you say is, we have this kind of understanding of what we're trying to do with these stories to create change. But I love what you've just shared about, this is the training of how to actually do those stories in a way that's going to even further impact change.
Absolutely.
And I think it's there's there's so much power in that, and people don't necessarily need to feel uncomfortable.
Right.
And even if you're uncomfortable, that's okay, because
Mhm.
that's saying that there's something changing within you or something
Yeah.
touching you within. But yeah,
Mhm.
how do you do that in a way that makes sense?
Right.
So we
Well,
can share this. We'll be sharing
yeah.
this with the audience. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll share the template and, any other links that will help to kind of walk teams through, how to actually use the template and, basically like we always do, all the resources that we've discussed, we will share. But I do think that this is kind of the start of a series on storytelling.
Yeah, I think
So
yeah,
we'll
yeah,
we'll be back next month for part two of
for part two.
storytelling. But
Yeah.
Gigi, it
Yeah.
was so great to
I just
spend
want
this
to
time
end.
with you. Yeah.
I just want to end one thing, because I know we're putting on the time, but just when you talk about stories, this one sort of thought to think through that came to my head just now is kind of going into thinking about, what is my story, what is your story, and what story we're going to create together.
I like that. Yes, I love that. Well, I
Mm.
can't think of a better way to close. So thank you so much for being with me again
Thank
today,
you.
and we will definitely be back next month with part two of our storytelling series.